I want to start this conversation, and you'll see it has no ambitions at all. We're only going to try to save the world. But I want to start this conversation actually pretty far both from India and from the United States where I hail from. I want to start in Ghana in West Africa. And Ghana is a country that I know really well. I've spent a lot of my adult life there. I lived much of my 20s there. I returned there a lot of times to work with the technology industry in the country. And about 2 years ago, I was in Ghana. I was visiting some young bloggers there, some people involved with Global Voices. But there was this one guy I really wanted to meet. And you can see him. He's the guy in the red fez. And you can see he looks like the guy in the room who would be having the most fun. His name is Efo Dela. And the reason I wanted to meet this guy was that he had been very active in a social movement in Ghana. So you see, in Ghana, one of the things that's going on is the nation is developing very, very quickly. It's becoming a wealthy nation, or at least a middle-income nation very, very quickly. People now have air conditioners, they have TVs, and the main problem that they have is that the power grid keeps going down. The power grid was designed for a much poorer nation, a much smaller nation, and so people are in the dark a huge amount of time. And they use this word, dumsor, which in the tree language means on and off, because that's what happens. The power goes on, the power goes off, and you're starting to see movements of people getting together. And if you can read their hashtags, it says, dumsor must stop. People are demanding that electric power become stable. This has become a really big movement within the country. In fact, there have been marches of tens of thousands of people into the center of the city demanding really consumer rights, demanding that people get the electricity that they're paying for. And this guy with the crazy hat, Efo Dela, he's one of the guys who helped organize these protests. And I've been following him online. I met the guy, and what I said to him was, hey, I want to learn about how people do political organizing in Ghana. How do you do this? Are you using WhatsApp? Are you using Facebook? What are you using to mobilize people? What are you doing when you're doing political mobilization in Ghana? And this young man looked at me and he said, whoa, I'm not political. And I said, wait a second. You've organized 5,000 people to march in the streets to demand electric power. You're telling me you're not political? He said, no, I'm not political. When someone says to me, I'm not political, in a lot of the countries that I work in, what they're saying is, shut up before we both get arrested. But that's not Ghana. That's not what's going on in Ghana. Ghana's a very different country. Ghana, in many ways, by many metrics, has more press freedom and more political freedom than my country has. This is not a country where you're going to get arrested for saying what you think. What Efo was saying to me was something very, very different. He was saying that if you were affiliated with the two main political parties in Ghana, and you're a young person, you're under 30, what it meant was you're an idiot. That no one smart has anything to do with politics. Because his feeling as someone under 30 years old in Ghana was that this is a rigged game, it's played by people who do it professionally, and it had no meaning for someone like him. And he went on to say, I won't even let people take a selfie with me if I know they're associated with NDC or NPP. I don't want anything to do with it, because I will lose all of my credibility if anyone thinks that I am somehow connected to politics. So I started thinking about this a little bit because it had a little resonance for what was going on in my country. We elected narrowly. I had nothing to do with it. I want to be extremely clear about that. My country elected a man whose main virtue, if he has one, was that he was not a professional politician. That's what he ran on. He ran on this stance of being anti-political. And this is really interesting. You can only get elected. Imagine if I applied for a job by saying, I'm not a professor, I know nothing about the subject that I'm teaching. In fact, I've never heard of media before, I've never studied any of it. Hire me, I'll be great. That's basically how the United States elected a president. And if you think about it, this is an attitude that I'm starting to see in a lot of the world. People in many cases are so frustrated, they feel so disempowered by politics as it is, that they're willing to look for someone who is as far from that world as you can possibly get. Now, let me make something really, really clear. I do not know India well. I get to come here, if I'm lucky, every 7 or 8 years. I catch up with friends. I try to keep up a bit with politics. I am not going to pretend that I know what's going on. I am also not making direct parallels between any situations in India and situations in the United States. Any parallels you choose are completely your own. The reason I am saying this is that you may have seen this talk listed as a master class. What you did not realize was it was not just me trying to teach, it was also me trying to learn from you. And what I'm going to ask is that I'm going to share some thoughts that I've had about the future of politics and more broadly, the future of civics, the future of social change, as is happening in the United States, as is happening in some other parts of the world. I do not know if these ideas apply in India. And in fact, what I'm hoping we can do in a conversation at the end of the talk, and particularly over coffee later during the day, is you can tell me whether this maps well to India, whether it maps not at all, whether it doesn't apply in the least. But I want to ask you to do that critical thinking, because I am not pretending that the argument that I'm going to make necessarily works for India. I will be really interested to see whether you think it does. But here's how this argument goes. In my country, in a lot of countries right now, you have a set of people who are pretty happy with how the system works. And if they want to make change, they're going to do it within the system. They're going to take office, they're going to vote for people, they're going to support political parties, and they believe that change will happen that way. My friend Chris Hayes calls those people institutionalists. They believe that our basic institutions may have some problems, they may have some flaws, but at the end of the day, those institutions are important, we have to trust them, we have to try to make change through those institutions. Then there's a group of people who we might call insurrectionists. These people generally think the institutionalists are idiots. They look around and they say, you must be kidding me. Do you really think this system is working? Look at what's happening. Inequality is incredibly high. In many countries, the government that's in power does not have popular support. In my country, the government that got elected did not even win the popular vote. In many cases, people's basic needs are not being met. The institutions themselves are the problem. Now, I'm not going to argue that the insurrectionists are right, that the institutionalists are wrong. What I am going to say is that both of these groups are really big. They're big camps. And a lot of these people who have become insurrectionists, they're not going to come back anytime soon and become institutionalists. They've simply lost faith that these structures are working. Now, these things don't map neatly to left and right. It's possible to be a right-wing insurrectionist. In fact, that's very much how Donald Trump got elected. He said, look, the system doesn't work, Washington is corrupt, I'm going to be a nativist, I'm going to be a racist, and I'm going to fix everything. He sounds a lot like someone like Duterte in the Philippines. He sounds very much like the people in Britain who supported Brexit and basically said, this is all the EU's fault, this is our fault for giving up our national sovereignty. That's right insurrectionism. But there's left insurrectionism too. And we actually saw a big wave of this in some of the previous years. When you looked at something like the Podemos movement in Spain, when you looked at these movements in Greece that were anti-austerity, the Occupy movement that started in the United States and spread everywhere, these were left-wing insurrectionist movements. They were not standing up and saying, we're going to vote someone new in as president. They were instead saying, the system is broken, and we need to find some fundamental way of changing that system. And my argument is that there's a lot of insurrectionists and that they have a point. They may be right. They may be right that some of the institutions that we live under are not serving us very, very well. So here's a graph that makes more sense in the US than it does in India, but again, it's a good place to ask yourself some questions. You go way back in time. You go way back to the 1960s and you ask Americans, do you trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time? 77% of Americans say they trust the government back in the 1960s. This starts falling in the 1970s. It falls really, really sharply between the 80s and the 90s. It comes back a little bit for a weird reason. We evade Iraq. The one time during my lifetime that the majority of Americans believe the government is doing the right thing is just before we invade Iraq. Just shows how much we know, right? Ever since then, we've been in a slide. And right now, 19% of Americans, fewer than 1 in 5, will tell you that they trust the government all or most of the time. It isn't just the government. It's all institutions. Since the 1960s, since the 1970s, in my country, our faith in institutions of all sorts has collapsed. We went from believing that the medical system basically worked, that we could trust banks, that we could trust churches, and in almost every case, we have lost confidence in those institutions. By the way, the one institution we have not lost confidence in, the military, which should terrify people, because the other place where people had confidence in the military and nothing else was Egypt. And once they ousted their government, they put the army in power. And if you ask Americans what percent of them would support a military government, that number is also around 20%, the same number of people who support the current government. Now, look, this is not everywhere. When you look at trust across countries, we are in very, very different places. India generally comes up as a very high trust nation. It's one of the highest scoring out there. The US is one of the lowest scoring out there. But you'll note that there are more low trust countries than high trust countries. This is a trend that is starting to happen globally. And we can have lots of arguments about that figure for India. Is that a real figure? Is that not a real figure? One thing I will note is that when economies are growing, trust in governments almost always goes up. When countries are stalling, as my country is, even ignore the whole GDP thing, real employment rates are actually pretty low, that trust tends to go down. So here's the thing. This may not be intuitively obvious, so I'm going to really stop and talk about it for a moment. If you don't trust your government, everything you know how to do as a civic actor is in danger of failing. When we teach students in school how to do civics, we tell you, you read the newspaper, you watch the television, you learn what people's positions are on the issues, you go out and you support your candidate, and you elect them to power, and you influence that person once they're in power. If you don't believe that your government will or can make real change, that whole process is broken. And this is something that we're facing in the United States. It's very, very hard to persuade people to take elections seriously. It's very hard to persuade people that that's how real change is going to happen. And so people instead end up looking at what happens if we take to the streets? What happens if we march? But here's the thing. Protest has to influence somebody. The most successful protests in the United States history were during the Civil Rights Movement. They went out, they had the March on Washington, millions of people came in to demand equal rights for people of color, for Black Americans. And the reason that it worked was that the president in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, went out, met with the marchers, and ended up advocating for the legislation that they were pushing for. Shortly after Donald Trump was inaugurated, and of course the largest inauguration in history, huge, huge crowds, believe me, many, many, many more women took to the street to protest his long record of sexual harassment. You will note that Donald Trump did not go out to meet those protesters, nor is it very likely that those women who were specifically protesting him and his atrocious relationships with women, that he's actually going to pay any attention to it. So one of the real dangers is that two of the ways that we know how to make change, either at the voting booth or through protest, both can end up failing when we have very, very little faith in the government that's in place. So here's the thing. I am trying to study what I see as a shift in citizenship. And you might think of the citizen that we learned about in our civics textbooks, right? When we go into those textbooks that Anushka's been making fun of, we might think of that as the informed citizen. This is the model we were all told we needed to be. We needed to know about everything. We needed to read the whole newspaper. We needed to be knowledgeable about all these civic topics because we might be asked to be knowledgeable, to vote on any of these issues at any time. And you know what? It's not realistic. It's really hard for all of us to be omnicompetent citizens. It's hard for us to be experts on everything and to follow everything. And what's emerging now is what I like to call the effective citizen. And the effective citizen is different. She knows she doesn't have to know about every subject. Instead, she may have a set of issues that she is extremely passionate about, that she's watching very carefully, that she's knowledgeable about, and she's looking for the way that she can take action. And maybe that's at the voting booth, and sometimes it is, and maybe it's through protest. But the most amazing thing about the effective citizen is that she has a much, much larger toolbox than we had in the past. This guy over here is Larry Lessig. He's an interesting guy. He actually ran for president of the United States in 2016. He lost so badly that no one heard of him in that context. The reason he ran for president was actually to demonstrate that the system was broken. He sort of did it as a way of demonstrating that if you weren't already a known figure, you couldn't even break into the process. But what he's really known for is he's a very smart philosopher about the internet. And many years ago, back in 2000, he wrote this book called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And the idea behind the book was, he said, look, we think that the world is run by laws. We think that laws constrain what we do and what we can't do. And the truth is the world is much more complicated by that. There's at least 4 ways that we're constrained. Laws make it legal or illegal to do something. Markets make it cheap or expensive to do something, right? If petrol's cheap, we tend to drive more. When petrol is expensive, we tend to drive less. There's norms, social norms, the rules that we all follow as members of society. These are very powerful. I've noticed that none of you have stood up and started disagreeing with me yet and started arguing back to me. There's no reason not to. It's just that we have a very strong social norm that whoever is in the front of the room and has the microphone is in charge, and until I give you permission to start talking back to me, generally speaking, you won't. There's no law preventing you, but there's a very strong social norm that probably means that we'll continue in this lecture format until someone declares otherwise. And where Larry really made a breakthrough was he said, computer code sometimes can act as a law. When you put a video into a computer, it's harder to do than it used to be. There used to be these DVD drives, you'd stick it in. It will tell you, you cannot copy this video no matter what. If you put in a CD, only difference is it's music versus audio. Your Macintosh says, hey, would you like me to make a copy for you? The only difference between those two is the code. The code in one case says, yes, make a copy. In the other case, it says, I will do everything to stop you from making a copy. So the code steps in and acts like law. So this is how Larry views the world. He says these 4 things sort of control what we do and what we can't do. Here's the big idea I want to leave you with today. If you turn that inside out, if you turn my friend Larry inside out, you get different ways to make change in the world. Those 4 forces that constrain our behavior, those are all levers we can use to make change. So let me try to explain what I'm talking about there. One of the more boneheaded things the Trump administration has done so far is undone everything the Obama administration tried to do with automobiles. So we had some laws. They were not nearly as strong as they are in Europe, but we had some fuel standards that were going to force more people to start driving electric cars, hybrid cars, and Donald Trump decided that fuel-efficient cars are dangerous, and therefore we should stop, trying to convert over to more fuel-efficient cars. Now, he's wrong, but he's wrong about everything. What this means is that we've made a change, that just this change, year by year, will increase the carbon emissions in my country as much as the nation of Bangladesh. So this is incredibly unfair, incredibly grossly unfair, and this is something that one man ended up doing. And so right now, trying to make change around climate in the United States through law, it's impossible. It's not going to happen. Here's the thing, though. Electric cars are really sexy. Elon Musk did something pretty smart. He said, not only am I going to make an electric car, I'm going to make it the hottest car out there. I'm going to make it the car that everybody wants. And then now that I've made it super sexy and everybody wants it, I'm going to make it cheap enough that people can start buying it. So you are starting to see Tesla right now is the most valuable car company in the United States. Can barely deliver cars, right? They can barely build a car, they can barely get it to people. But they're worth more money than everybody else because people are really psyched about electric cars. I'm buying an electric car, not a Tesla, I'm not that rich, but I am buying an electric car. And I'm doing it, first of all, because screw Donald Trump, but second of all, I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and it now makes sense. The market has made it make sense for me to make a decision that will help the climate. This is how people use markets to make change. The great thing about making change with markets is that if you do it well, you can do it at really huge scale. It's change that ends up paying for itself. And so when you see people engaging in social enterprise, when you see people doing boycotts and boycotts, all of that is trying to figure out how to use the market for change. Here's another thing that isn't changing anytime soon. Even under the Obama administration, that nice liberal Obama administration, my country was spying on my because as it turns out, many of you are non-US citizens, and under US law, we have the right to surveil any communications with non-US citizens. Again, really bad, not something we're going to change in the law. Here's the fun thing about this. This dude, this sort of scary looking dude, goes by the name of Moxie Marlinspike. It's not actually his name. No one actually knows his name. He's a cryptographer. He did something really interesting. He created a piece of software called Signal Messenger. And by the way, if you don't have this on your phone, I highly recommend it. Signal Messenger from Whisper Systems. This is very, very powerful encryption. This is what Edward Snowden uses. You can get it for free. I use it for all of my communications. And so suddenly, average people for free can have a tool that the NSA can't break. And all you have to do is sort of install it, and suddenly you are free from surveillance in the way that people would hope to be. The amazing thing that Moxie did was not build Signal. The amazing thing he did was get that encryption built into WhatsApp. So WhatsApp now has this by default. Now I will warn you, it's not clear how long it will stay in WhatsApp. WhatsApp is now owned by Facebook. Facebook doesn't necessarily have the greatest record on user privacy. I recommend Signal rather than WhatsApp for that reason. But suddenly, more than 1 billion people are using strong encryption, which is a great way to keep secrets safe from the US government. Code is also amazing for making change at scale. It's very hard to think about another circumstance in which one person could change a whole issue as profoundly as Moxie did around this. When you have code, it can spread to 1 billion people and change the world very, very quickly. Law, of course, is the way that we often end up making change. It's the way that we're most familiar with. It's the way that feels like we should be doing civics. In many ways, it's the part where we think this is how civics is supposed to run. And I was talking before about how the March on Washington turned into legislation that radically changed the United States. But there's more to that story. It often takes a very long time for these legal changes to take place. It took more than 50 years between the moment where we decided that someone with dark skin and someone with light skin could get married to the point where we decided that 2 men or 2 women could get married. And what's interesting is it wasn't just time that passed, it was attitudes that changed. When intermarriage came around in the United States, it was very early on. People in the United States were absolutely not supportive of interracial marriage. And when Loving versus Virginia, the court decision that made this possible, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans thought that black people and white people should be able to get married. So if you think about it, what our Supreme Court did was incredibly brave. They said, we know this is not popular. We know you don't agree with this, but this is right. These are human beings. It doesn't matter the skin color. People should be allowed to get married. Law was way ahead of social norms at that particular moment. My country is not as brave as it used to be. So here is a similar graph, and this is people's attitudes around equal marriage for gays and lesbians. And you can see it also starts out pretty unpopular in the late 1990s, but by the time that we actually pass these laws, it's incredibly popular. More than 60% of Americans support gay marriage by the time the lawyers catch up and actually make the decision in court. And this is how this tends to work these days. These days, norms precede laws. It's very hard in America at the moment to pass laws that the majority of people don't agree with. It's actually very hard sometimes to pass laws that the majority of people do agree with. Something like 80% of Americans would tell you that they do not want people carrying concealed handguns. We absolutely cannot pass a law that's been able to get handguns off the street. But in this case, in this one particular case, 60% of people are supporting the rights for gay and lesbian people to get married, and we actually get law behind it. Changing norms turns out to be one of the most important things that people can do in making social change. One of the critical stories in the United States over the last 10 years is the story of Michael Brown. Michael Brown was an 18-year-old kid. He had just graduated from high school. It was summer. It was August. He had a confrontation with a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and the police officer shot him several times and killed him. His body lay in the street in the hot August sun for about 4 hours before anyone took the body and brought it back. And this turned into a massive movement in the United States, Black Lives Matter. People standing up and saying, we have a real problem in the US with police violence against black people. What's interesting is that this movement unfolded online as well. And it had everything to do with this picture. That picture on the left, Mike Brown standing there, flashing a peace sign, that was the picture that newspapers in the United States and television stations used to illustrate Mike Brown's death. They found it on his Facebook page. That's where we find all photos these days. But interestingly enough, from the same period of time, there was also this photo of Mike Brown. They're very different photos. That first photo is shot from below. He looks tall, he looks tough, he looks big, he looks older and tougher than he actually is. Men in the crowd here, you probably, as a teenager, you had pictures where you were trying to make yourself look all badass. That's what that picture is. This picture is what Mike Brown looked like. He's a kid, 18 years old, he's in high school. So people started asking this question, what are the images the media use to portray us when we get killed? And this very specific question, if they gunned me down, what picture would they use? And you saw tens of thousands of African Americans go on social media, pick out 2 pictures off their Facebook. One in which they looked as respectable as you could be, a Marine in dress uniform. Another one where this guy is flipping off the crowd. And the point is, the images matter. They matter how we think about black people. They matter how we think about who was responsible in that confrontation with Mike Brown. This starts on Twitter. It's not organized by anyone. It's a young lawyer in Alabama who just spontaneously does this. There's tens of thousands of these posted. Within 3 days, the New York Times, our biggest newspaper, runs a front page story about the movement. What's amazing about this is if you go on Google right now, you can't find that picture of Mike Brown, that picture where he's standing on the porch. It's been replaced with this picture of him in the graduation cap and gown. In fact, if you do it, the one image you'll find is the image from my slide deck, which ends up there where you're putting the two of them together. People were able to make a change in representation. And here's why that matters. When that police officer shot Michael Brown, the law wasn't involved. It's illegal for a police officer to shoot someone who is nonviolent and who is unarmed. It's been illegal to shoot black people for a long time. It doesn't stop it from happening. What happened was that officer had racial biases. He had an attitude in his head that a young black man was dangerous, and more dangerous than a young white man would have been, more dangerous than he actually was. You can't change that just by changing the law. You have to change hearts and minds. You have to change attitudes. And that's what happens when people go and try to change norms. Here's the good news. We know how to change norms. Media is an incredibly powerful force in changing norms. We know that media can be one of our most powerful tools for making social change. She talked a little bit about the Harvard Alcohol Project. I want to tell you a bit more about the story. What was happening in the United States in the mid-1980s was that drunk driving was one of the leading causes of death. People were going out, they were getting drunk, they were going and killing people on the streets. We know how to fix drunk driving. Scandinavia had a program starting in the 1930s of designated drivers. If you were at a bar, if you were at a party and people were drinking, one person would decide not to drink and would drive everybody else home. Harvard Alcohol Project wanted to introduce this idea. And they knew that if they did public service announcements, if they were really preachy about it, it wouldn't work. They had to make it funny. And so what they did is they took maybe the most popular TV show on air at that time, a show called Cheers. Cheers is a show about all these drunk people in Boston who hang out in the same bar together. And it was very funny at the time. And so they did an episode in which this character, Norm, has to drive everyone home because he's the designated driver. And rather than being excited about this, rather than everybody saying, ooh, designated drivers, what a great idea, Norm hates this idea. And in fact, the funny part of the episode is to get revenge on the bartender, Norm drives all the drunk people to his house. So when the bartender goes home from work, all the drunk people are there on his porch. So this is not a serious episode. This is an episode that's introducing this in a way that's funny, that's lighthearted. And that turns out to be the power. You don't necessarily have to hit people over the head with a message. Sometimes simply introducing the concept is what's most important. We call this, in communications, we call this agenda setting. And agenda setting is basically, how do we decide what we're going to talk about, what we're going to argue about on any given day? And there's this very famous idea that the media is not very good at telling us what to think, but it's really good at telling us what to think about. The media doesn't say, be for Modi, be against Modi, but it says, we'd better pay some attention to Modi. He's the prime minister. This is very serious. We've got to have an opinion on this. Media is really good at saying, this is now what we're going to think about and what we're going to talk about. And so the goal of the Harvard Alcohol Project wasn't, let's persuade everyone that designated drivers are a good idea. It was simply to say, let's have a conversation about designated drivers. There's another thing that media does incredibly well, which is again around norms. Media helps make things normal. It helps make them commonplace. So this is Ellen DeGeneres. You may have seen her, very popular talk show host in the US, 15 seasons on the air. This is Ellen's wife. They're married. Very visible lesbian figure in the United States. Incredibly important in the US for normalizing gay and lesbian identity. Because Ellen's whole image is that she's very approachable, she's very easy to talk with, she's everybody's friend. She is watched mostly by older white women, people who are often very conservative. But now they feel with Ellen like they have a gay friend. They have a lesbian that they know, and they know she's married, and they know she's happy, and they know she's a good partner. My friend Ed Schiappa at MIT has something that he calls the parasocial contact hypothesis. It builds on the contact hypothesis. The contact hypothesis says, hey, say you're biased against a group of people. Say you're biased against Muslims. You start hanging out and spending time with Muslims, you're probably going to end up liking Muslims, because it turns out most people are really nice. And so if you simply have more contact with a group of people, you're probably going to end up with a positive view of them. The parasocial contact hypothesis says you might have that effect just from seeing images of people. Just by encountering a lesbian on the screen, just by watching a film with Dalit heroes in it, you might end up changing attitudes, and you might end up feeling differently about a group that you're paying attention to. And this has been very well demonstrated. It's been very well proved. So why do we care about media? We care about media because activists are learning how to influence norms by making media and by amplifying it, by putting it out in the world. We live in a world right now. You guys keep taking photos of my slides, you keep taking photos of me. You're making media. Whether you think of it that way or not, you post that to Facebook, you put it on WhatsApp, you are a broadcaster. And that is the nature of the world today. We are all media makers, we are all media amplifiers. And so we now have this power to think about how we shape norms. Here's the thing about this world. Now that we all make media, now that it's not hard to be a broadcaster or to be a publisher, you used to have a printing press, you used to have a radio station, now all you need is a phone. But now that the ability to make media is no longer scarce, something else is scarce: attention. The hardest thing, the most valuable commodity many of us have right now is attention. There's only so many things that we can pay attention to. And for activists, this is simply the hardest thing. There's so much wrong in the world. There's so many different changes that we want to make that getting attention is really critical. And this is why civic entertainment is so powerful. In a world where so much else is going on, many of the people in this room spent 3 hours watching a film earlier today. And you did it possibly because you wanted the social message behind it. It's also a really fun film. There's a lot of funny parts in it. There's a lot of drama in it. It was a nice way to spend 3 hours. At a moment where our attention is incredibly scarce, something that can grab our attention, that can really capture us for a little while, has amazing power. So this combination of being able to grab our attention and harness it towards a civic goal, this idea that making social change by changing norms and then using norms to change laws, this is what makes civic entertainment so incredibly powerful. Now, I mentioned that Anushka and I work together. We work together on something very specific. It's a tool. It's called Media Cloud. And this tool exists in part so that we can measure attention. It's a tool that basically looks at a huge number of websites, newspapers, and tries to figure out what people are talking about on any given day. And I was really curious because a lot of this talk has been around gay rights. I was interested in how people talk about gay rights in India and in the United States. And with Media Cloud, this took me 2 minutes. I was able to come and search for gay rights. I searched on Indian national news sources. I searched on US national news sources. India's in red, US is in saffron. You'll see in general the US talks a little bit more about gay rights than India, but it's pretty comparable. And then you see this huge spike down here in late July. Do you know what that is? Spikes at the same time in India and in the United States. It turns out there's a prince in Rajasthan who's opened up his home to gay and lesbian couples who were being shunned by their families. And this is a story that was so compelling, it was so interesting, that it actually took over the US news cycle as well as taking over the Indian news cycle. It was a story that we were interested in because it was entertaining. It was striking, it was diverting, but it got people to talk about gay rights at a time when they might not otherwise talk about it. We built this tool so we could study media and try to figure out what do those moments look like? What are the effects? We just saw this panel before us talk about how do you measure the effects of all of this different work? Well, I'll show you how we do it. I mentioned Michael Brown before. I mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. After Michael Brown's death, you saw the media in the United States report much more often on people of color, black people, who were killed by police. In fact, we were able to show, using our tool, that you're about 11 times more likely to get a newspaper story if you were a black person killed by the police after Michael Brown than before Michael Brown. We were also able to show that those stories are different. That before Michael Brown, people reported on this saying, it's really too bad this person got shot. After it, 22% of the stories mention another victim, which means what they were actually saying was, this is part of a trend. This is a problem. We systemically, in the United States, have a problem with police officers killing people of color. So we're able to demonstrate a real change that sort of ends up happening in the media. So here are the things that I'm hoping you'll take away from this. There's at least two ways to be a good citizen these days. You can work within the institutions, or you can try to use this new expanded toolkit that insurrectionists find themselves using. I think all of us have to start taking this new toolkit seriously, because I think in societies where there's very high mistrust, civics as usual just isn't going to cut it anymore. This new toolkit doesn't just include law. It's got law and norms and markets and code. And norms are incredibly important because if you're going to change the laws, it really helps to change the norms. It helps to change the hearts and minds first. And then finally, if you're going to make change, any of these tools, one of the key things you're going to have to do is find some way to capture attention, which is why I think the work that Anushka and others are doing is so incredibly important. So I want to remind you again, I'm not convinced that this makes sense in an Indian context, and you're going to tell me whether it does or not. You're going to tell me either now or in a conversation afterwards. But for someone who's just given a talk about how important attention is, I just want to thank you so much for giving me the chance to be here and for listening to me. I really appreciate it.